In the quiet town of Braunau am Inn, Austria, a boy named Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April, 1889. Like many children, he didn't arrive with a grand destiny written on his forehead. He was simply a child with wide eyes, a vivid imagination, and a heart full of dreams. He loved to sketch scenes from nature and imaginary battles, often lying under the sky for hours, watching clouds and letting his mind wander into worlds no one else could see. To him, art wasn't just a hobby, it was a language, a voice, a future. He whispered his dreams to his mother, Clara, who listened as if every word from his lips was sacred. Clara was his safe haven. Her warmth softened the edges of his world, a world often dominated by the stern voice of his father, Alois Hitler. Alois was a man of discipline, a civil servant who believed in structure, obedience, and tradition. He demanded that Adolf follow in his footsteps, become a government worker, earn a respectable income, and serve the empire. But Adolf's heart didn't beat for such a life. The idea of stamping papers in a gray office seemed like a prison cell compared to the canvas and paint he longed for. The tension between father and son grew thicker with each passing year. Alois couldn't understand why his boy clung to a dream he considered childish and unrealistic. "Art is not a career," he would shout. Adolf, in return, would often say nothing. He'd take the criticism quietly, but inside, it hurt. The rejection of his passion by the person who was supposed to guide him was a wound that never healed fully. These moments carved silence into his soul, the kind of silence that doesn't calm, it suffocates. When Alois died suddenly in 1903, Adolf was just 13. For some, the loss of a controlling parent might bring a strange sense of freedom, but for Adolf, it left an unexpected emptiness. He no longer had to defend his dream, but he also lost the only source of structure in his life. Without the push and pull of his father's rules, he drifted. His schoolwork began to suffer. Teachers noted his potential but were disappointed by his lack of effort. "Smart but careless," they would write. Adolf no longer cared. His mind was somewhere else, perhaps still in the sketchbooks he used to carry, or perhaps already building alternate worlds in his imagination where he could be powerful, admired, and finally understood. What many forget when studying history's darkest figures is that before the decisions, before the ideologies, before the power, there was a child. A child who longed to be seen, to create, to be loved without conditions. It is not an excuse, but it is a truth, and truth is where all learning must begin. The story of Adolf Hitler does not begin with war or speeches. It begins with a quiet boy in a small town, caught between a dream and a command, with a heart too full for the life he was being forced to live. In this first chapter of his journey, we don't yet see a dictator or a political force. We see a conflict that many of us know too well, the tension between who we are and who the world demands we become. This space between authenticity and expectation is where many destinies are shaped, sometimes beautifully, sometimes tragically. And perhaps, in understanding that early space in Adolf's life, we can better understand our own. Vienna was supposed to be the beginning of everything. When Adolf Hitler left his small hometown and arrived in the Austrian capital, he carried more than just a suitcase, he carried hope. To him, Vienna was not just a city, it was a sanctuary of creativity, a place where artists turned dreams into masterpieces. The grand buildings, the music in the streets, the galleries echoing with centuries of brilliance, all of it, felt like a world that had been waiting just for him. This was where he believed his destiny would unfold, where someone would finally look at his work and say, "Yes, you belong here." With trembling hands and a determined heart, Adolf submitted his drawings to the Academy of Fine Arts. He believed, with all the fire of youth, that this was his moment. But dreams don't always follow the paths we designed for them. The rejection came swift and cold. His portfolio, his proudest effort, was dismissed. The judges told him he lacked the skill for admission. He was stunned. The boy who had endured his father's criticism, who had clung to a dream for years, now heard the same message from the very place he believed would rescue him. "You're not good enough." Still, he tried again. A year later, with improved work and renewed hope, he reapplied. But again, he was turned away. This second rejection didn't just hurt it, humiliated him. It made him question not only his talent, but his place in the world. Without education, without a job, and without the one dream that had kept him going, Adolf fell into a silent kind of despair. He drifted through the streets of Vienna, not as a student of art, but as a young man trying to survive. He rented small, dark rooms when he could afford them. Sometimes, he slept in shelters or on park benches. He sold hand-painted postcards to tourist-y pieces of beauty exchanged for a few coins. He watched others succeed, while he remained invisible. The city that once felt magical now seemed indifferent to his existence. It was during these cold, quiet years that something inside him began to change. He started looking outward for explanations to his inner failure. It was easier, perhaps, to blame the world than to face the fear that maybe he wasn't meant to succeed. Slowly, silently, resentment began to replace hope. He read political newspapers, angry pamphlets, and conspiracy theories. His thoughts, once filled with light and color, grew darker, more bitter. His dream had not only been denied it, had been crushed. And in its place, something far more dangerous was beginning to grow. Adolf's story during these years is not only about failure, but about transformation. The kind of transformation that happens when disappointment turns into bitterness and loneliness into anger. It's a chapter filled with silence, the kind of silence that shapes a person from the inside out. And while no one around him could yet see it, Vienna was not just the city where Adolf's dreams died. It was the city where a very different kind of vision began to take root, one no longer built on beauty or creativity, but on control, power, and revenge. This is where the road quietly bent away from what could have been, and toward what history would never forget. When the thunder of war echoed across Europe in 1914, Adolf Hitler saw not terror, but an opportunity to reinvent himself. The boy who had once chased beauty through art was now a man seeking meaning in a world that had ignored him. He volunteered for the German army with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The battlefield, with all its chaos and danger, gave him what the art world had denied him: identity, structure, and the illusion of belonging. For the first time, he was part of something greater than himself. The uniform fit him better than the painter's brush ever had. In the army, there were no art critics or rejections, only discipline, orders, and comradeship. Adolf served as a message runner, darting between trenches with information under heavy fire. It was brutal and terrifying, yet he carried out his duties with bravery. He was wounded, but returned. He was honored with 2 medals for courage, and those brief moments of recognition ignited something deep within him. He was no longer invisible. In the eyes of the military, he mattered. But as the war dragged on, the cost of this new identity became clear. The noise of gunfire replaced the silence of his youth, yet inside, a different kind of silence, settled a silence heavy with rage. When Germany finally surrendered in 1918, Adolf was devastated. He hadn't just lost a war, he had lost the only place where he had found purpose. Like many German soldiers, he returned to a country in ruin, humiliated, economically shattered, and politically fractured. The streets were filled with anger, starvation, and uncertainty. For Adolf, it felt like betrayal. He believed Germany had not been defeated in the trenches, but stabbed in the back by its own leaders, by traitors who had signed the surrender. This idea, however false, took root in his heart. It became the lens through which he saw everything that followed. The sense of betrayal hardened him. He no longer sought beauty or even belonging, sought revenge and redemption, not just for himself, but for a nation he believed had been wronged. During this time, he began attending political meetings, not as a leader, but as an observer. He watched how others spoke, how they stirred emotions in desperate people. Slowly, a new version of himself began to emerge, not the quiet boy who sketched nature, not the lonely man in Vienna, not even the soldier, but something else entirely. A man who had tasted meaning in war, who had felt powerful in uniform, and who now longed to lead. The war had ended, but for Adolf Hitler, it had only just begun. The battlefield had not destroyed him. It had given him a new mission. And in a Germany filled with pain, confusion, and rage, there were many who were desperate enough to listen. In the broken aftermath of war, Germany became a nation searching for someone to blame and someone to follow. Its cities were no longer symbols of culture and strength. They were quiet ruins echoing with hunger, unemployment, and humiliation. Adolf Hitler, who had returned from the trenches with a wounded pride and a burning belief that Germany had been betrayed, saw something others didn't. He saw a stage. And for the first time, he realized that his voice, not his art, could move people. It began in small, smoky rooms. He would stand in the back, observing local political groups argue over Germany's future. One of these was the German Workers' Party, a tiny circle of angry voices and broken dreams. At first, Adolf simply listened. But when he finally stood up to speak, something electric happened. The room went silent. His voice wasn't just loud, it was urgent, raw. He didn't offer soft answers or compromise. He gave people emotion. He gave them someone to blame. And in their pain, they listened. Adolf discovered he had a rare gift, the ability to translate fear into fire. His speeches were not elegant, but they were unforgettable. He didn't speak to people's minds. He spoke to their wounds. He shouted what they were too ashamed to say out loud. He told them they had been robbed to be politicians, by foreigners, by anyone who wasn't truly German. It was dangerous rhetoric, but to the desperate, it felt like hope. As his audience grew, so did his ambition. He officially joined the German Workers' Party, then quickly took control of it. He changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what the world would come to know as the Nazi Party. He gave it new colors, red for revolution, white for unity, and black for strength. In the center, a twisted ancient symbol, the swastika. It became more than a logo. It became a promise of restored pride, a badge of belonging in a world that felt lost. Rallies replaced paintings. Words replaced pictures. Where once he had tried to sketch a mountain or a meadow, now he painted images in the minds of the masses, images of a strong Germany, pure and powerful. And the people, starving for purpose, believed. They filled halls and stadiums to hear him speak. Some came with questions, most left with conviction. But it wasn't just about politics. Adolf had begun to master something far more subtle, to performance. Every gesture, every pause, every rise and fall in his voice was deliberate. He didn't just deliver speeches, he cast spells. The crowd's energy became his mirror, and he learned how to manipulate it, when to make them cheer, when to make them cry, when to make them hate. What began as a voice in a small meeting hall was now an echo spreading across Germany. He was no longer a forgotten artist or a nameless soldier.
He had become a storyteller, and the story he told was seductive, that Germany was not broken.
It had been betrayed, and he was the one chosen to restore it. The power of words had replaced the silence of failure. And for Adolf Hitler, this was the first real taste of control, a taste that would grow into hunger, and later into catastrophe. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, it was not with the thunder of war or the crash of revolution, but with applause. He had risen not through brute force, but through the careful manipulation of hope, fear, and despair. To many Germans, he appeared not as a tyrant, but as a savior. A man who promised to rebuild what had been broken, to restore dignity, bring jobs, and give Germany its voice back. And in those early days, he delivered just enough to be believed. Under Hitler's leadership, unemployment dropped rapidly. Massive infrastructure projects were launched, new highways, bridges, factories. Streets that had once echoed with protest now buzzed with construction. The economy began to breathe again, and the people, hungry for progress, began to trust the hand that fed them. Germany looked stronger, more confident, more united. On the surface, it felt like a miracle. And to many who had suffered through years of humiliation and poverty, Hitler seemed like a man who had not only heard their cries, but answered them. But behind this mask of progress was a machinery of control, built with precision and purpose. Hitler understood that power was not only about delivering change, it was about shaping belief. Newspapers, once diverse and critical, were quickly silenced or transformed into propaganda tools. Radios were tuned to one frequency, the voice of the Führer. Schools rewrote history and recited ideology. Children grew up not learning to ask questions, but to repeat slogans. Truth became something flexible, something defined by the state. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this transformation was how ordinary it all seemed. People cheered in the streets. Flags flew from balconies. Songs were sung in classrooms. The swastika became not just a symbol, but a part of daily life. And through it all, Adolf Hitler stood at the center not just as a politician, but as a myth. He was no longer just a man. He was Germany. To criticize him was to betray the nation. Meanwhile, a quiet fear grew beneath the surface. Those who spoke out disappeared. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. The SS, Hitler's private army, watched, arrested, and punished. New laws targeted specific groups, especially Jews, who were blamed for everything from economic failure to cultural decay. At first, it was exclusion, then violence, then silence. One of Hitler's most insidious achievements during this time was the creation of the Hitler Youth. Young boys and girls were taught to idolize him, to believe in strength over empathy, order over freedom. They marched, sang, and trained not to think but to obey. A generation was being shaped not by truth but by fear dressed as loyalty. And so, as the factories roared and cities sparkled with new hope, something much darker was taking root. The illusion of national rebirth blinded many to the cost of that vision. Those who felt empowered by Hitler's words rarely asked who had to suffer for their dreams to come true. In this chapter of Adolf Hitler's life, power no longer needed. A stage it had become architecture, education, even childhood itself. And while the world outside Germany watched with cautious curiosity, inside the country, a dangerous new normal had taken hold. One that replaced questions with orders, and replaced humanity with ideology. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would plunge the world into darkness. With a single command, German troops marched into Poland, and the world changed overnight. What had once been bold promises and stirring speeches was now brutal reality. The invasion was swift and merciless, and within days the Second World War had begun. Hitler, who once spoke of national pride and unity, now revealed the full weight of his ambition, domination, expansion, and the creation of a world in his own image. At first, it seemed as though nothing could stop him. His army, modern and disciplined, swept through Europe with terrifying speed. Country after country fell: Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. The Nazi flag rose where freedom had stood, and Hitler stood before cheering crowds as if he were not just a leader, but a force of destiny. To many within Germany, he appeared invincible. To those beyond its borders, he became the face of fear. But it wasn't only borders that were being destroyed. Behind the front lines, a different war was unfolding, one that wasn't fought with tanks or bullets, but with hatred. Hitler's vision of a pure Germany meant the systematic removal of those he deemed unworthy: Jews, Roma people, people with disabilities, political dissidents, and anyone who did not fit his ideal. What began as exclusion became extermination. Ghettos were established, families torn apart, lives reduced to numbers. And then came the camps places built, not just to imprison, but to erase. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a cold, calculated operation. Men in uniforms wrote names, checked lists, scheduled trains. Bureaucrats signed papers. Scientists conducted experiments. Guards followed orders. And in doing so, millions of innocent people vanished into the silence of gas chambers, crematoria, and mass graves. It is here that the cost of ideology, of blind loyalty, of hate, disguised as strength, revealed its full horror. As the war dragged on, cracks began to appear in Hitler's empire. His decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 stretched his military thin. Harsh winters, fierce resistance, and endless fronts began to turn victory into survival. In the West, the Allies led by Britain and the United States fought back with growing strength. Bombs fell over German cities. Fear returned to German homes, not as whispers of dissent, but as fire in the skies. Still, Hitler refused to admit defeat. His speeches grew more desperate, his strategies more reckless. He sent thousands of young boys into battle with little training. He punished generals who questioned him, He trusted fewer and fewer people, surrounding himself only with those who fed his illusions. The man who had once inspired millions now ruled through fear alone. His dream of a vast empire had become a nightmare for all who lived within it. By 1944, the war had turned. What was once a story of conquest became one of collapse. But even as the walls closed in, Adolf Hitler would not surrender. He could not. The world he had built in hate, fear, and absolute control was falling apart, and rather than face it, he doubled down, dragging a broken nation further into destruction. The final act of this war was no longer about victory. It was about denial, desperation, and the refusal to face the truth. By the beginning of 1945, the world that Adolf Hitler had built brick by brick, lie by lie, was collapsing. Once mighty German cities now lay in ruin, turned to ashes by relentless Allied bombing. Once loyal citizens, who had once called him a savior, now huddled in fear, questioning how they had come to believe so deeply in a man who had led them into catastrophe. The war was lost, though few dared to say it aloud. And deep beneath the streets of Berlin, in a dark concrete bunker, Hitler faced the ending he had always feared but never prepared for. Surrounded by cold walls and fading loyalty, Hitler spent his final days in isolation. The man who had once stood before roaring crowds now wandered the narrow corridors of his underground refuge, paranoid, gaunt, and trembling. He trusted no one. He spoke in fragmented thoughts. The spark that once lit his speeches had faded into rambling orders no longer rooted in reality. Even his generals knew the truth. Berlin was surrounded, the Soviet army was closing in, and the Reich was finished. Yet, even in these final moments, Hitler refused to accept responsibility. In his eyes, it was the German people who had failed him, not the other way around. He believed they hadn't been strong enough, loyal enough, pure enough to achieve the vision he had promised. It was a final act of denial that revealed how deeply detached he had become from the very humanity he had claimed to defend. On the 29th of April, 1945, in a strange gesture of intimacy amid destruction, Hitler married Eva Braun, the woman who had stood silently beside him for years. Their wedding took place in the bunker, witnessed only by a few remaining aides. It was a quiet, almost surreal ceremony. Outside, bombs shook the earth. Inside, there was only a whisper of vows between two people who had chosen lover, perhaps loyalty at the end of the world. The next day, the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives. It was not an act of courage, but one of escape. The man who had once commanded nations now chose death over accountability. Hours later, Soviet soldiers entered the bunker. The war in Europe ended soon after, but the damage lingered for generations. Germany lay in ruins, cities flattened, its people broken, its soul scarred. Millions were dead. The Holocaust had left behind a silence that the world would struggle to understand. And those who survived would carry not only grief, but the burden of remembering. What, then, is the legacy of Adolf Hitler? It is not one of power, but of warning. He is remembered not for what he built, but for what he destroyed. His story is not just about the rise of a dictatorate, it is about the silence of those who watched, the desperation of those who followed, and the cost of trading truth for certainty. History does not demand that we hate the past, but that we learn from it. Hitler's life reminds us how easily a wounded soul, when fueled by anger and unchecked ambition, can ignite a fire that consumes the world. But it also teaches us that every decision matters, that the way we treat others, the voices we choose to follow, and the courage we show in the face of injustice all shape the world we live in. In the end, Adolf Hitler left behind not a legacy of greatness, but a shadow. And in that shadow, the world learned to say, never again.